Eddie Gilfoyle in 1993 was convicted by Liverpool Crown Court of murdering his heavily pregnant wife, Paula, who was found hanged in their garage.
And that was an enormous story at the time, wasn't it? And he got quite a lengthy sentence after being found guilty of it.
Yeah, well, he was given life because it was murder. And magazines would talk about this story. It was quite a good one for magazines, being an apparent domestic murder case. But it did fall out of public consciousness, and people did forget about the case fairly quickly.
And one of the sort of interesting bits of that story was the fact that his late wife Paula had left this suicide note, and that in the trial he'd been accused of faking it or forcing her to write that before he killed her. And as you say, this had all maybe drifted out of the public consciousness until around 2008, I think it was, and someone approached the Times about the story.
Yeah, and it was David Cantor, and he is the pioneer of criminal profiling in Britain.
Mm.
And David Cantor had assisted the police in their investigation, which ended up in the conviction of Eddie Gilfoyle. But after more thought and more research, David Cantor had come to the conclusion that that had been mistaken, that an innocent man had gone to jail, and that in fact this murder had not taken place.
And how did that come to your desk, and what did you make of it when you heard who this man was and what he was trying to tell you?
Well, my editors presented me with this possible story. David Cantor wrote a long article for the Times in which he explained his position.
Mm.
And that was incredibly brave of him, because in public life, almost nobody ever says they get things wrong. And he not only admitted that he'd decided that his original conclusions were wrong, but he's someone who relies on being a consultant and an expert for his living. So it was very courageous for him to do so. And then I started looking at Eddie Gilfoyle's case as a news story to see if there was anything of interest. And the thing that first really struck me was the quality and calibre of the people who believed that the conviction was unsafe.
Mm.
And they were, for example, Lord Hunt, used to be David Hunt, who was his local MP and sat in the cabinets of Margaret Thatcher and John Major. And Lord Hunt used to visit him in prison. Another person who supported him was Alison Holford. Alison Holford was the former Assistant Chief Constable of Merseyside, the police force that had effectively convicted him. She used to visit him in prison. And then also Desmond Brown. And Desmond Brown chaired the Bar Council, so effectively he was the leader of all our barristers. So I did feel confident that there was something more to look into here.
And when you started looking into it, what eventually did you find in terms of question marks?
Yeah, well, there were concerns about the quality of the police investigation. The incongruity really was that Paula Gilfoyle would have left in her own handwriting a suicide note, and that this had been dictated to her from her husband. It was quite a high bar to imagine that happening.
And did you find, what kind of information did you find though to back that up?
Yeah, well, I wanted to know whether the suicide note, in terms of its wording, looked like it was genuine. So I contacted one of the world's experts in suicide, who was the president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention. And he showed the note to a dozen of his colleagues, two of whom had studied hundreds of suicide notes. And their conclusion was that the wording appeared to be genuine, and that it could only have been faked if the person faking it had studied suicide notes and was particularly good at preparing a false one.
Incredible. And you also mentioned that there were concerns over the actual quality of the police investigation. What did you find on that front when you tried to dig into that?
Well, there was a really amazing moment in looking into the story, because Mr. Gilfoyle's family had complained to the Police Complaints Authority about the quality of the investigation. And the Police Complaints Authority sent a senior officer, Graham Gooch, from another force to look into the investigation. He was another very courageous person, because the more he looked at the case, the more he decided that there wasn't a murder and that actually the poor woman had taken her own life. And he told the Police Complaints Authority this, and they alerted the Crown Prosecution Service that there were problems, potentially, with the safety of this conviction. Now, I knew that there were concerns about the way in which the police had handled the death scene, that there had been blunders, not made deliberately, but still errors had been made.
In terms of how they kept it secure or free from contamination?
The trouble is that everybody thought that it was a suicide, and so they didn't bother to preserve the scene and the evidence and record evidence in the way that you would do if you think you're walking into a murder scene.
So initially, the police thought this was a suicide, but then that changes and they think it might be a murder instead.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened, yeah, because the reason for that is everyone around Paula Gilfoyle was saying she could never have killed herself. She was looking forward to this baby. And the police then smelt a rat. And I knew there'd been an internal investigation by Merseyside police looking into what had gone wrong. I asked Merseyside police for the notes of that investigation, and they repeatedly told me the notes don't exist. There are no notes. And then somebody gave me a box.
Somebody?
Yeah, somebody, a source. We don't say as reporters who our sources are, but
yeah,
somebody who knew about the Gilfoyle case said, look, here's a box of documents and papers. You can work through them if you want to, see if there's anything that springs to mind. And as I was working through this box of papers, I discovered some pieces of paper which they were unmarked and I couldn't tell what they were. And the more I looked at them, the more I realised these were the notes of the Merseyside Police internal inquiry, which they said didn't exist. And the contents of those notes were quite important. They detailed exactly what had been the errors made at the death scene. And they also said, which had never been realised before, that the doctor who pronounced death had also given an estimate of the time of death. And that precise estimate that the doctor gave would have given Eddie Gilfoyle an alibi, because he was known to be in his hospital where he was working as an orderly at the time that the doctor first said Mrs. Gilfoyle had died.
So here you have evidence not only of a key bit of information which then wasn't passed on and used in the trial, and as you say, could have been used by his defence to help him give an alibi, but also details of concerns within the wider police world about how this whole thing had been investigated. You also looked, I guess, at a sort of broader point, which at that time, and as you say, this was the early 90s, there was a sort of prevailing thought that, well, you couldn't have a pregnant woman who would take her own life, and that's how it was characterised in court. But you actually dug into that presumption a bit further.
Yes, and what happened there is that it was received wisdom at the time of the trial in 1993 that pregnant women didn't kill themselves, and the idea was that pregnancy is actually a defense against suicide, and it's rare for a pregnant woman, more rare than for other women, to take their own lives, and that may well be true. However, there is another side to all of that. And what I discovered was that there had been a government-funded research report subsequent to the trial, which showed that the main cause of maternal death in women was suicide, and that the main method used was hanging. So that put the case in a different light. In fact, I'd say that all of the other points about errors made at the death scene and the suicide letter and that type of thing, they're the edifice of this conviction. They all look unsafe, but the foundation of the conviction is that pregnant women don't take their own lives. That's the only reason why the police were looking into it, because they were told by her friends, her shocked friends, that she was bubbly and looking forward to having the baby and had everything to live for and so on. So they became concerned, why would this poor woman have done such a thing when she was pregnant and looking forward to having a baby? That is the foundation on which this case was built, and it looked more shaky.
Well, and even shakier when there were more revelations about actually, how she was feeling in those weeks leading up to her death. You found a diary, is that right?
What happened was that Eddie Gilfoyle's lawyer, Matt Foote, finally managed to get the police to hand over a diary which was kept by Mrs. Gilfoyle. The diary showed that Mrs. Gilfoyle had suffered a lot more distress in her life than anyone could have realised. It was a young diary. It was her young years. It showed in the diary that she'd tried to take her life before. And that an ex-boyfriend of hers, who'd been convicted for killing a girl, when he was in prison serving life, she got him a wedding ring. So she'd had a really quite troubled and difficult life in some ways. And this is quite different from the picture given to the jury of a bubbly, happy woman looking forward to the baby with everything to look forward to.
So this is the late 2000s, as you say. The first tip on the story you got was 2008, wasn't it?
That's correct.
So this was years and years after Eddie Gilfoyle's conviction. What happened to him? Now there's all of this extra information out there.
Yeah, well, I spoke to Eddie Gilfoyle when he was in prison. He'd done 17 years by then. And I spoke to him by phone, and he said that he would never make a false confession to murder, and he'd rather die in prison. The parole board eventually did release him, and his case went to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which looks into possible miscarriages of justice. And they spent 5 years looking at it, looked at thousands of pieces of paper, and they declined to send his case to the Court of Appeal. So he remains, although he's not in prison anymore, he remains a convicted murderer.
Looking back on this, I mean, this case has rumbled on for years and years, and it must have been covered differently throughout those years as well, as I guess society changes and some of those ways of looking at things change, particularly, how pregnant women we think might feel, etc.
Yes, that's right, because this story went on for so many years. I covered it on many occasions, so there would often be a completely new generation of Times executives hearing the story for the first time. And as we came to understand as a society much better about issues of mental health and pregnancy and the like, I would find particularly women executives coming up to me bewildered that the authorities could ever have found it unthinkable that a woman might have harmed herself or taken her life when she was pregnant.
That's The Story from The Times and The Sunday Times. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.